Right, as I said, you will have recognized, no doubt, part of that reading from last week. And I'm not ashamed to say, as both Roy and Barry have said as well, we are overlapping very heavily in what we're covering because of the nature of the topic. You can't talk about families without thinking about husbands and wives. So there is that link. As Roy said, today we're concluding our Love is in the Air series by looking at the family. And I was thinking how to start, and I thought, well, perhaps the trick is we look at some families from the Bible. Because surely we'll get an example there of how to do it. So that's what I've done. We're starting with a few examples. So we'll start with Jacob, the youngest son of Isaac. Well, Jacob had a troubled youth, and you can read about it in Genesis 25 to 27. We get worried about sibling rivalry, but it's a bit much when one of the siblings is actually threatening to murder the other one as soon as their father dies. But that's where Jacob got to with his brother Esau. When Jacob had a family of his own later, through his 2 wives and their servants, he settled for a while near the city of Shechem. And while he was there, Shechem, the son of the ruler of the area, Hamor, raped his daughter Dinah. Jacob learned about what had happened, but because his sons were away, it tells us in Genesis 34:5, he didn't do anything about it. Now Shechem wanted to marry Dinah, but Jacob's sons used the fact that he wanted to marry her to trick and then massacre the whole town in revenge for the attack on their sister, which also you can read about in Genesis 34. And Jacob's only response was a feeble protest at what they'd done and how it was going to make them odious in the sight of the locals, which his sons basically said, don't worry, we're worried about it. Of course, with little parental restraint, the brothers then felt emboldened to plot to murder Joseph, whom they hated both for the dreams he had had and for being Jacob's favorite. This is in Genesis 37. But then they saw an opportunity not only to get rid of Joseph, but to get some cash from it, and they sold him to some Ishmaelites as a slave. And they then lied to Jacob, suggesting Joseph had been killed by a wild animal, where Joseph, in the meantime, ended up in Egypt. Not a great family. God was able to use the actions of Jacob and his families to save his chosen people later. Genesis 45:5 tells us that. But it didn't make what they did right. And I guess that means that Jacob's family isn't one whose examples we should be following. So children, put your fingers in your ears and don't listen to that bit. Okay, so I thought, well, let's find another family. Well, how about King David? Surely he'd be better. David, held up as the man after God's own heart in the Bible. But it doesn't mean he was faultless. For starters, he married polygamously. I shouldn't have written that, should I? Despite the warning in Deuteronomy 17:17, the king must not take many wives or his heart will be led astray. Well, David's first wife was Michal, King Saul's daughter. And then, while he was a fugitive, David married 2 other women. Abigail, widow of Nabal, in 1 Samuel 25, and Ahinoam of Jezreel in 25 verse 43. Then when David became king of Judah, he had 6 sons by 6 wives. 2 Samuel 3:2-5 lists them. And he also reclaimed King Saul's daughter. And then David decided one year, at the time that kings go to war, that he wasn't going to bother. He sent his army off, but he was going to stay at home. And he decided while he was lazing around the palace, he'd go up on the roof, and he saw Bathsheba taking a bath. Ended up seducing her, getting her pregnant, and that led to him murdering Uriah the Hittite, Bathsheba's husband, in 2 Samuel 11. And it actually hurt more than it looked because Uriah was one of David's best soldiers. In 2 Samuel 33, verse 39, it lists him among the 30, which was only the second tier of the army after his immediate bodyguard. And David then married Bathsheba, wife number 8. Okay, David repented and was forgiven by God for the sin, but he was also told he would have trouble with his family thereafter in 2 Samuel 12:11. And he did. His oldest son, Amnon, raped Tamar, his half-sister, and Amnon's half-sister, and the full sister of Absalom, who was the second oldest surviving son in 2 Samuel 13. David was angered by that, but he didn't punish Amnon because he loved him as his eldest son, in verse 21 of that chapter. And so Absalom murdered Amnon. Then some 5 years later, David finally reconciled with Absalom in 2 Samuel 14, only for Absalom to stage a coup against David just a few years later. The coup failed, with Absalom being killed in battle, but David was so distressed by Absalom's death, despite his rebellion, that he nearly lost his army and his throne as a consequence in 2 Samuel 19, 1-8. And it didn't finish there, because in David's latter years, his oldest son, remaining now, Adonijah, also made a bid to be king, despite his father's intention to make Solomon king. 1 Kings 1, 5-7 and verse 13. Verse 6 tells us David had never previously disciplined Adonijah. He'd never said no to him. And while David was able to thwart the coup and install Solomon on the throne, Solomon later had Adonijah executed because Adonijah tried again and tried to topple Solomon after David's death. So David's sin and some of his failings as a parent, including again favoritism and lacking appropriate discipline of his sons, resulted in years of suffering and death. Okay, another family we probably shouldn't follow the example of. Next example I picked was Jesus. Now, let's be clear, Jesus didn't have a family of his own, but he was the oldest son of Mary and Joseph. And perhaps I should have called this Mary and Joseph rather than Jesus. But Jesus had 4 brothers and at least 3 sisters. We know that from Matthew 13, 55 and 56, and Mark 6, verse 3. We're told in Matthew 1:19 that Joseph was a righteous man. And Mary, we're told in Luke 1:30, had found favor with God. So they were both godly people. Yet they had difficulty understanding their oldest son. For example, you can see that said explicitly in Luke 2:41-51. Despite this, despite being misunderstood by his parents, despite knowing that he was the Son of God, Luke 2:51 tells us that Jesus went down with them, came to Nazareth, and was obedient to them. So Jesus obeyed his parents while he was growing up, despite knowing who he was. But during his ministry, Jesus had a challenging relationship with his family. In John 2, we read about the wedding in Cana where they ran out of wine. Absolute social disaster, running out of wine at a wedding. It would be a disaster nowadays, but even more so in those days. His mother tried to push him to assist because of the lack of wine. But although Jesus did assist, the way he responded to Mary can be read as him pointing out to her that he was obedient to God the Father, not her, primarily. We're told in John 7, 1-9, that Jesus' brothers didn't believe in him. They thought he was out to make a name for himself. And they suggested to him one festival, just before the Festival of Booths, if you want to be a star, go to Jerusalem, make yourself known, because that's what you do if you want to make your name. There you go. For no one who wants to be widely known acts in secret. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. And we know that at one point, while he was teaching in Galilee, Jesus' family came to speak to him. Now, Matthew tells us about that in chapter 12. Luke tells us in chapter 8. Mark includes it too, but Mark adds an extra comment in Mark 3 that Jesus' family thought he was out of his mind. At best, they thought he was in some form of religious mania and had become eccentric. They may just have taken it literally at word length. They thought he'd gone round the bend. Okay, that was marginally better than the teachers of the law at the same time, who were accusing Jesus of being demon-possessed. but it's not the support you would expect from your family. But on the other hand, when Jesus was being crucified, Mary, his mother, was there close by, supporting her son at the cross, in John 19, 26 and 27. And after his resurrection, Mary and Jesus' brothers were among the believers who gathered with the disciples, which is stated in Acts 1:14. Perhaps more like a family we can relate to, where there's rivalry, but actually at the end, everyone pulls together. But all these families had issues with their relationships with each other. But just because we know even commended biblical characters failed to live up to the ideals of family, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do better. So what I want to do is look at the principles that Paul gives us in Ephesians 5 and 6 for living as a Christian family. But before we do, I do want to look briefly at the cultural context of the society Paul was writing to. Ephesus was a Roman colony. Barry touched on some of this last week. In most ancient societies, a woman was either under the authority of her father or of her husband. She was his possession in the same way as his house or his horse or any other property that he had. And similarly, children were not recognized as people. In fact, a Roman father could kill his children without consequence at any point up until they came of age. The head of a Roman family had absolute authority over his household. Wife, family, slaves, everything. And the culture was such that though his wife was expected to be faithful, the husband could have extramarital relationships as he saw fit. So not a nice place to be. But despite this, many Romans felt that Eastern religions, and they had quite a few coming in from Egypt and Persia, but especially including Judaism and Christianity, they felt they were undermining Roman family values. And a lot of people writing on behalf of these so-called Eastern religions wrote what were called household codes, which were written to show support for the Roman values and how they weren't in conflict with the religion. And in the passage that Say read for us this morning, Paul uses that household code format to structure his argument. That's why he talks about the relationship between husband and wife, between father and children, and the bit we haven't looked at and won't be, which is masters and slaves. But what he states as principles for the Christian family are very countercultural to a Roman audience. And though our culture today is very different to that of ancient Rome, Paul's teaching remains just as challenging for us, just for somewhat different reasons. So what are these principles? Well, first of all, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. The very first verse Say read, Ephesians 5:21. We've all seen, and no doubt those of us who are of a certain age will remember many sermons about wives submitting to their husbands. Barry covered this in some depth last week, but one thing I just want to pick up is, in the Christian relationship, it's not the wife submits, the husband makes all the decisions and gives the orders. It's about a partnership. And one thing that's very clear, if you've got two people trying to make a decision and you can't agree, someone's got to have a casting vote. But yeah, so Paul, that was the husbands and wives. And for children in 6:1, children to obey their parents. But it's a wider principle than just the wives and the children. It applies to the man as well. In verse 25, husbands are told to love their wives as Christ loved the church. Okay, well, how did Jesus love the church? We've seen it on the videos earlier. We know it by heart. Jesus died for us. The word used here for love by the husbands is the same word that is used for Jesus' love for us, agape. And agape, and that is Ephesians 5:25 with the Greek underneath it. You can see, again, where it says love. There you go, agape, Jesus' love, agape. Agape is the highest and noblest form of love, a love which sees something infinitely precious in its subject, a love which doesn't look for a tit for tat. You might not deserve me loving you, you might have done terrible things, but I still love you despite that. In other words, what Paul's saying is the husband should put his wife first and be prepared to do anything for her, even die for her if necessary, just as Jesus put our need to be saved before his own position as the Son of God and came and died for us. Now that's very different from the non-Christian household codes of the time, because those typically told the husband how to be the boss, how to rule their households, including their wives and children. And for us today, when you say wives should submit to their husbands, don't the hackles come up automatically in so many places? No, I'm not being subordinate. I've got equality. Yes. But nevertheless, that is how God has designed the family for that role. Despite the challenge, despite the fact it could even be seen as being oppressive in places, it shouldn't be because of the love. But the obedience, the submission that is expected in a Christian family comes with boundaries. Okay, first of all, that submission is based on that agape love. It's the same way that we should each be submitting to and obeying Jesus in gratitude for what he has done for us through his death and his resurrection. And as Paul put it in Ephesians 5:1-2, be imitators of God as beloved children, and live in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us, a fragrant offering and a sacrifice for God. That is the image that we need to have in our mind when we're thinking about family relationships, whether it's being obedient to your parents, submitting to the wife submitting to her husband, the husband caring for his family. That is what comes first. It's a sacrificial love. And unlike the expectation for a Roman wife or child to absolute obedience at all times in any circumstances, and I remember years ago being interviewed for a job, and somebody said to me, well, you're ex-military. How are you going to cope in an environment where it isn't, you say jump, and the only question is how high as I jump? Well, I was offended, partly because, as anyone who's serving those, it doesn't work quite like that in reality most of the time anyway. But also, I've been in the civilian for 10 years by then, and surviving quite nicely, thank you. But it's that was what was expected. If the husband said, you did, there was no discussion. That's not the way it was for Christians. But also, it's clear that the things that should be obeyed are only in line with God's word. And Jesus made that quite clear, very dramatically, when he said this, whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Luke 14:26-27. That's not saying that literally, because you're a Christian, you should be hating your family. No, but we've got to put Jesus first. Our family, even our own life, cannot and must not come before our obedience to Jesus. And then the second principle, love one another. Verse 5:25. Okay. Through this part of Ephesians, the family relationship is repeatedly likened to that between Christ and the church, a relation of sacrificial love. The motivation for everything in the family should be agape love for each other. As Jesus said, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also should love one another. That was given to the disciples. It's given to us. This love, we've already seen, is the basis on which a wife submits to her husband or a child to their parent. But it's also key for the parents' relationship with the children. In 6:4, fathers are told not to provoke their children to anger. Now, I think at the early ages, there isn't really a problem there, maybe, though we all know about the terrible twos, I'm sure. But what about teenagers? They seem to have a very short fuse and very sensitive, whatever. And I'm sure Roman teenagers were no different to modern ones. They would have wanted to do their own thing. They would have wanted to have more freedom than they were allowed by their parents. But Roman family discipline could be severe. It wasn't unusual for children to be beaten. Even learning. The key tool of a Roman teacher wasn't textbook or a slate and a thing. It was a stick. You learnt your lessons by rote, and if you got it wrong, you got a whack, and sometimes quite a severe whack. Not aided probably by the fact that the teacher was often a slave, and that was his one way of getting back at the family for enslaving him in the first place. So how easy would it have been for those Roman children to feel unjustly treated and to get angry about their treatment? Well, Paul calls on Christian parents to teach and discipline their children, but to do it in a way which is consistent, just, and moderate. Applying discipline, again, bad word in modern society. Too many people think of discipline and think immediately of physical chastisement of some sort. There are plenty of other ways that displeasure can be expressed and children can learn that something has consequences. But I will also say, parents should always be prepared to explain why they set certain rules. If you want them back by 10 o'clock, have a reason. Explain it to them. Okay, that reasoning may change as their age changes because they can understand more different things. But make it clear that there is a purpose behind it, not just arbitrary. And most of all, we know that children imitate. They'll imitate their friends. Hopefully they'll imitate their parents if we give them the right example. And we need to make sure that our relationships in the family always show the love of Jesus. And that way, parents can lovingly lead their children to develop the right moral compass, to know and to understand God's law and God's standards. When I was preparing this, I came across somebody commentating on 1 Samuel 3, 4-10. It's when God first spoke to the young Samuel. And the commentator noted that Eli was acting as a surrogate parent in that because Samuel had been given into God's service. And that Eli guided Samuel to respond personally to God. And they said, our task as parents is to be as God to our children in their early years, as Eli was to Samuel, to basically explain to them what God's way is. But he said we also need to point beyond ourselves so that their children might come to know God in their own right in due course. Because if they don't, they'll have a childish faith and it won't survive. And that's what we need to be doing. When the time is right, we should be pointing them at Jesus. Now then, children, this one's for you. So listen up if you... Children are called to be obedient to their parents. As we saw earlier, despite being the Son of God, Jesus was obedient to his human parents as he grew up. Now, there's an old story I've come across, I'm sure you've heard variants of it. There's a child growing up. When he was small, wow, his parents were wonderful. They knew everything, and they were always right. Weren't they fantastic? And then he got into his mid-teens. Oh, dear, what has gone wrong? Parents don't know anything. They don't understand. They're past it. They're going senile. This is useless. And then he got into his 20s. And gosh, haven't the old folk learned a lot in the last couple of years? So one thing to say, children, when your parents are telling you to do something, and hopefully they're abiding by the principle we said, remember, and I know it's hard, to remember that actually your parents, I'm a parent as well, we've all been children at some point. Yeah. We've all been round the block. We've been through so many of the same experiences that you have today. Okay, the technology's different, but we got bullied. Well, hopefully not the bullies, but it happened. We struggled at school. We had fights in the playground. Things went wrong. We couldn't understand school. We've all been there. And because we've been there, we can give you sensible advice. It's worth listening to. I think it was Roy said, you don't have to take it, but at least listen, because we do know what we're talking about. And the other thing, children, you should remember is your parents want the best for you. As parents, we love our children. We want you to grow up to be the best you can be. Now, we've got to recognize that most parents will fail from time to time. We will make mistakes. We'll get it wrong. And unfortunately, some parents will fail badly. And in a few cases, there may be parents that are even abusive to their children, or men or women who are abusive to their spouses. So not everybody does have a good experience of family life. But the majority of parents want to do the best for you. And then there's a final principle which comes at the very end of this part of Ephesians, bit that Say didn't read for us, which is devote yourself to prayer, Ephesians 6:18. Families can be challenging. I think anybody who thinks they haven't had a challenging family, put their hand up. Yeah, I saw a few sitting on their hands at that point. Families are difficult. We all are aware of our own failings. And even children, if you think about it, you can think of times when you've perhaps not been as good as you could be. You've gone off the rails a bit. We can't live on our own in accordance with God's principles, but we don't have to. So we should pray. We should pray as individuals, and ideally pray as a family. Whether you're facing a family crisis or a family celebration, pray about it. Include God in it. Seek His will and His power to deal with whatever you face. And don't forget, particularly parents, but also children, pray for the other members of your family, because they need God's help as much as you do. So we've looked at the principles for family living as that Paul wrote in his letters. And I'm sure we can all think of the ways that we've failed to live up to them. And that's because we're all tainted by sin. Our desires have been twisted to put us first and everyone else, even our family, second. Back to that bit of cake. Which one are you going to choose? The instinct is the big one, not the little one. But as disciples of Jesus, He's working in us day by day. He's changing us to be more like Himself. But that work isn't going to be completed until we're standing in front of Him. And we aren't alone in our family failures, as we've seen. Even the most prominent families in the Bible, and having picked out Jacob, David, and even Jesus' family, I thought there must be some other ones. Do you think about it? If you can find a family which had a really good relationship, and there was no rivalry and no jealousy and no squabbling in it, in the Bible, please let me know. I'd love to know where it was, because I couldn't find one. Families that are a challenge. They can be difficult. They put us under test. And of course, in a family, we're in a glass jar. You can be a good, upstanding Christian at work and go home and kick the cat. You can't do that in a family because everyone sees it. But praise God, he has made a provision for our failures, for our broken families, and for our damaged relationships. Isaiah 53:5 tells us, he was wounded for our transgression. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Sometimes our families need healing. And if we do, we need to confess our failures. And if necessary, apologize to the members of the family that we've hurt by what we've done. So let's make sure that we rely on God's mercy and grace to cover our failures. That we rely on his strength and guidance as we seek to navigate the complexities of our families. As we try to pick up the pieces from our mistakes and strive to bring up our children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And may each of us seek to live as witnesses for Jesus in our homes and through our families, as well as outside them with people we meet otherwise. Amen.